Billionaire CEO sued ex-wife for fraud. The script flipped when he found out the reason. You're stealing from our family's future. Alexander Blackwood's voice echoed through their marble foyer, his face twisted with rage and betrayal as he held bank statements that showed $2 million missing from their joint account. Victoria stood frozen at the bottom of their grand staircase, her hands shaking as she clutched a manila envelope containing medical records she couldn't show him. Alexander, please, just listen to me. I can explain everything if you'll just explain. Alexander cut her off, his gray eyes blazing with the kind of fury that only comes from feeling utterly betrayed by someone you trust completely. Explain how my own wife has been systematically stealing from me for 18 months? Explain how you've been lying to my face every single day while bleeding our accounts dry. It's not what you think, Victoria whispered, tears streaming down her face as she took a step toward the man she'd loved for 10 years. The money, I needed it for something important, something that couldn't wait. Important? Alexander laughed bitterly, crumpling the bank statements in his fist. More important than our marriage? More important than our children's future? More important than the trust that's supposed to exist between a husband and wife? Victoria's voice broke as she reached toward him desperately. Alexander, if you would just let me show you why. I don't want to see your justifications, Alexander snapped, stepping away from her outstretched hand. I don't want to hear about whatever scheme you've been running or whoever you've been planning to run away with. Victoria, you've stolen $2 million from our family. That's not a mistake or a misunderstanding. That's fraud. The manila envelope fell from Victoria's trembling fingers, medical records scattering across the Italian marble floor. Please, she sobbed. Please don't do this. Please just trust me one more time. Trust you. Alexander's voice was deadly quiet now, more terrifying than his shouting had been. Victoria, I'll never trust you again. And when I'm done with you, you'll pay back every stolen penny, even if it destroys you. Have you ever discovered that everything you believed about someone you loved was wrong? Have you ever realized that your need to control destroyed the very thing you were trying to protect? Tonight, you'll witness a billionaire's world shatter when he discovers the real reason his ex-wife stole $2 million from him, and why the truth will haunt him forever. But here's the question that will destroy you. What do you do when you discover you destroyed your family over a lie you created yourself? If you believe that sometimes the truth is more devastating than any lie, and that control can be the most destructive force in a relationship, hit that subscribe button right now, because this story will change everything you think you know about love, money, and the price of being right. For years earlier, Alexander Blackwood had always believed that money was love made visible. At 35, he commanded a technology empire worth $2.8 billion, and he ran his household with the same meticulous attention to detail that had made Blackwood Industries a global powerhouse. Victoria, we need to discuss the household budget for this month, Alexander said one evening as he spread financial statements across their dining room table. His wife of 6 years sat across from him, her dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail she'd started wearing since their twin sons were born. What about it? Victoria asked, bouncing 2-year-old Oliver on her knee while Owen played quietly in his high chair. You've exceeded the grocery allowance by $300, Alexander said, pointing to a highlighted line on the expense report. And there's a charge for art supplies that I don't remember approving. Victoria's face flushed slightly. The art supplies were for my class at the community center. I told you I was going to start teaching again, just a few hours a week. Teaching for free, Alexander pointed out. Victoria, we've discussed this. Every dollar has a purpose. When you spend money on supplies for volunteer work, that's money taken away from our family's future, from Oliver and Owen's college funds. It was $60, Alexander, Victoria said quietly. For supplies to teach underprivileged children how to paint. $60 here, $300 there, Alexander replied, making notes on his tablet. It adds up, Victoria. Financial discipline is what separates successful families from those who struggle. Victoria looked at her husband, this man she'd fallen in love with when she was a struggling art teacher making $30,000 a year. Alexander had swept her off her feet with expensive dinners and weekend trips to places she'd only dreamed of visiting. He'd convinced her to quit teaching and focus on being his wife, promising to take care of all her financial needs forever. I used to manage my own money just fine, Victoria said softly, though there was no real fight in her voice anymore. Managing a teacher's salary and managing our family's wealth are completely different challenges, Alexander replied, his tone gentle but condescending. Victoria, I love you, which is why I want to protect you from the stress of financial decisions. You're an artist, sweetheart. You think with your heart, not your head. Money management requires logic and discipline. Victoria nodded, though something inside her chest felt tight and small. You're right. I'm sorry about the overspending. I'm not angry, Alexander said, reaching across the table to squeeze her hand. I just want us to be responsible. Every dollar we save now is a dollar that Oliver and Owen will have for their futures. Over the next 2 years, Alexander's financial oversight of their household became increasingly detailed. Victoria had a credit card, but statements were reviewed monthly. She had access to a household account, but every expenditure over $50 required explanation. Alexander installed financial tracking software that categorized every purchase and generated reports he reviewed weekly. Why do you need to know how much I spent on shampoo? Victoria asked one evening as Alexander questioned a $28 charge at the pharmacy. Because financial transparency is the foundation of a strong marriage, Alexander replied, not looking up from his laptop, where he was categorizing their expenses. When couples keep financial secrets, that's when problems start. This way, we both know exactly where every dollar goes. But you don't tell me about your business expenses, Victoria pointed out. Business finances and household finances are separate matters, Alexander said simply. You don't need to worry about the company's cash flow or investment strategies. That's my responsibility. Your responsibility is managing our home efficiently within the budget we've established. Victoria felt like an employee in her own marriage, but she told herself that Alexander's controlling nature came from love. He'd grown up poor, the son of a single mother who'd struggled to keep food on the table. His need to control every financial detail was just his way of ensuring their family would never face the insecurity he'd experienced as a child. Mama, why does Daddy always work with numbers? 4-year-old Oliver asked one afternoon as Alexander spent their family time reviewing investment portfolios on his tablet. Because Daddy wants to make sure we have everything we need, Victoria replied, though she couldn't remember the last time Alexander had played with the boys without his phone or tablet nearby. Can we go to the park now? Owen asked hopefully. After Daddy finishes his work, Victoria said, though she knew Alexander's work was never really finished. Alexander looked up from his tablet with mild irritation. The park? Victoria, we were there last weekend. That's a 45-minute round trip plus parking fees. We have a perfectly good backyard with expensive playground equipment. The boys like seeing other children, Victoria said carefully, and the fresh air is good for them. Fresh air doesn't cost money, Alexander replied. But gas, parking, and the inevitable requests for ice cream or playground snacks do. We need to be more mindful about unnecessary expenses. Victoria felt something inside her shrinking a little more. Of course, you're right. But she wasn't right, and Alexander wasn't right, and their marriage was slowly suffocating under the weight of financial control that felt more like surveillance than partnership. The breaking point came when Oliver and Owen were 5 years old and Victoria discovered something that would change their lives forever. Mrs. Blackwood, Dr. Patricia Chun said gently, closing the medical file that contained the results of the twins' comprehensive neurological evaluation. I need to discuss the test results with you. Victoria sat in the pediatric neurologist's office, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She'd brought the boys in for what she'd thought was a routine evaluation after their teacher mentioned some concerns about their motor skills development. What kind of concerns? Victoria asked, though something in Dr. Chin's expression was already preparing her for devastating news. Oliver and Owen have a rare genetic condition called progressive muscular atrophy, Dr. Chin said carefully. It's a degenerative disorder that affects muscle strength and coordination. The condition is genetic, which means both you and your husband are carriers, though neither of you shows symptoms. Victoria felt the world tilt around her. What does that mean for the boys? Without treatment, they'll experience progressive muscle weakness over the next several years, Dr. Chin explained. Loss of mobility, difficulty with fine motor skills, and eventually more serious complications. However, there's good news. There's a new experimental therapy that's shown remarkable success in slowing and sometimes reversing the progression. What kind of therapy? Victoria asked, hope and terror warring in her chest. It's a combination of gene therapy and specialized physical rehabilitation, Dr. Chen said. The treatment takes place over 18 months and requires weekly sessions with specialists in Boston. Mrs. Blackwood, this therapy could give your sons normal, healthy lives. That's wonderful, Victoria said, relief flooding through her. When can we start? Dr. Chen's expression grew more serious. There are two complications. First, the therapy is experimental, so insurance won't cover it. Second, because it's still in clinical trials, the cost is substantial. How substantial? Victoria asked, though she already knew the answer would be challenging. $2 million, Dr. Chen said quietly. Paid over 18 months directly to the research facility. Victoria felt her breath catch. $2 million. More money than she'd ever seen in one place. More money than she'd ever imagined needing for anything. I understand that's overwhelming, Dr. Chen continued. But Mrs. Blackwood, without this treatment, Oliver and Owen will likely be in wheelchairs by the time they're teenagers. This therapy could save not just their mobility, but their entire future quality of life. Victoria drove home in a daze, her mind racing with possibilities and impossibilities. $2 million to save her son's futures. $2 million that Alexander would never approve without months of research, cost-benefit analysis, and financial projections that might delay treatment beyond the optimal window. She knew her husband well enough to predict his response. He would want second opinions, third opinions, consultations with financial advisors about the impact on their long-term financial planning. He would research alternative treatments, investigate insurance appeals, and explore every possible way to minimize the cost before approving such a massive expenditure. Victoria also knew that Dr. Chun had emphasized the importance of starting treatment as soon as possible. Every month of delay meant more irreversible muscle damage, more lost time in her son's development. That evening, Victoria tried to broach the subject carefully. Alexander, I took the boys to see Dr. Chen today for their developmental evaluation, she said as they sat in their living room after dinner. And? Alexander asked, not looking up from the financial reports he was reviewing. She found some concerns that need follow-up, Victoria said carefully. Some potential issues with their muscle development that might require additional monitoring. What kind of monitoring? Alexander asked, finally giving her his attention. Victoria took a deep breath. Possibly some physical therapy sessions, regular checkups, maybe some specialized treatments. How much is possibly going to cost? Alexander asked immediately. Victoria hesitated, knowing that the wrong answer could derail any possibility of treatment. I'm not sure yet. Dr. Chun is putting together a treatment plan. Victoria, you know better than to commit to anything without getting cost estimates first, Alexander said, his tone sharpening. Medical providers love to order expensive tests and treatments that insurance doesn't cover. We need to be smart about this. It's for our children's health, Victoria said quietly. Which is exactly why we need to be careful, Alexander replied. Desperate parents are easy targets for expensive experimental treatments that don't actually work. We need to approach this logically, not emotionally. Victoria felt her heart sinking. So you want me to tell Dr. Chun we need to research our options before starting any treatment? I want you to get a second opinion, a cost breakdown, and an analysis of what insurance will and won't cover, Alexander said firmly. Victoria, children's health is important, but bankrupting the family won't help anyone. We're billionaires, Alexander, Victoria said, frustration creeping into her voice. How could any medical treatment bankrupt us? Alexander looked at her with the expression he used when explaining basic financial concepts. Victoria, being wealthy doesn't mean spending money carelessly. It means being strategic about every major financial decision. Medical treatments can cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. We need to understand exactly what we're dealing with before we commit to anything. Victoria nodded, knowing the conversation was over, but understanding with devastating clarity that Alexander would never approve $2 million for experimental treatment without extensive deliberation that could take months they didn't have. That night, Victoria lay awake staring at the ceiling while Alexander slept peacefully beside her. Her sons were upstairs in their beds, their small bodies already beginning the process of muscle deterioration that would steal their futures if she didn't act quickly. Over the next week, Victoria researched everything she could about progressive muscular atrophy and the experimental treatment Dr. Chun had recommended. Every medical journal, every patient forum, every specialist consultation confirmed the same thing. The therapy worked, but only if started early. Delays decreased effectiveness dramatically. Dr. Chun, how long can we wait before starting treatment? Victoria asked during a follow-up appointment. Mrs. Blackwood, I strongly recommend beginning within the next month, Dr. Chun replied. The earlier we start, the better the outcomes. Every month of delay means more muscle damage that becomes irreversible. And if we wait 6 months while we explore other options? Dr. Chin's expression was grave. The therapy would still help, but the boys would have lost significant function that they'd never recover. Mrs. Blackwood, if these were my children, I would start treatment immediately. Victoria made her decision that day, sitting in her car outside the medical complex with forms for the treatment program in her hands. Alexander would never approve $2 million quickly enough to help Oliver and Owen. But Victoria had access to their joint account, and she had the authority to make withdrawals for family medical expenses. She could save her sons' futures, even if it meant lying to her husband about the cost. The first withdrawal was $100,000, transferred to the Boston Research Facility to secure Oliver and Owen's spots in the therapy program. Victoria listed it as a payment for developmental specialists on their expense tracking, technically true but deliberately vague. What's this $100,000 medical charge? Alexander asked 2 weeks later, reviewing their monthly financial statements. The boys started working with some specialists for their muscle development issues. Victoria replied, her heart racing but her voice steady. $100,000? Alexander's eyebrows shot up. Victoria, that seems excessive for some physical therapy sessions. It's a comprehensive program, Victoria said carefully. Dr. Chun recommended specialists who work with children with developmental delays. The program includes assessments, therapy sessions, and ongoing monitoring. Alexander frowned at the bank statement. I want to review the treatment plan and get a second opinion before we continue with something this expensive. The boys have already started, Victoria said quickly. Dr. Chun says interrupting the therapy could set back their progress. Victoria, you should have discussed this with me before committing to such a large expense, Alexander said, his voice carrying a warning edge. $100,000 requires my approval. It's for our children's health, Victoria replied, meeting his gaze steadily. I thought you'd want them to have the best possible care. Alexander studied her face, and Victoria forced herself to appear calm despite the terror churning in her stomach. She was lying to her husband, systematically and deliberately, for the first time in their marriage. Going forward, any medical expenses over $10,000 need my pre-approval, Alexander said finally. And I want to meet with Dr. Chun personally to understand exactly what we're paying for. Of course, Victoria agreed, knowing she would find ways to delay and deflect such meetings while continuing the treatments that were already showing positive results in Oliver and Owen's muscle strength tests. Over the following months, Victoria became an expert in financial deception. She made withdrawals in smaller amounts, spread across different accounts. She listed payments as various medical-sounding but vague expenses. She learned to forge Alexander's signature on authorization forms and became skilled at providing explanations that were technically truthful but completely misleading. The boys seemed to be doing really well with their therapy. Alexander observed one evening as he watched Oliver and Owen playing in the backyard with energy and coordination that had markedly improved over the past 6 months. Dr. Chun says they're responding beautifully to the treatment, Victoria replied, which was completely true. The experimental therapy was working exactly as promised, strengthening the boys' muscles and halting the progression of their condition. Good, Alexander said with satisfaction. It's nice to see our money being well spent on something that's actually making a difference. Victoria smiled and nodded, knowing that Alexander had no idea they'd spent over $1 million on the treatment that was saving their sons' futures. In his mind, the boys were thriving because of some reasonably priced physical therapy sessions, not because his wife was systematically transferring their wealth to save their children's lives. "Victoria, I need to ask you about something," Alexander said one evening 18 months after the treatments had begun. His voice carried a tone she'd never heard before, cold and suspicious. Victoria looked up from where she was helping Oliver with homework, her stomach immediately knotting with anxiety. "What is it?" "I've been reviewing our financial statements for the past year and a half," Alexander said, spreading bank records across their kitchen table. "There are discrepancies I can't account for." "What kind of discrepancies?" Victoria asked, though her heart was already racing. "Missing money," Alexander said simply. "Large amounts of missing money that don't correspond to any expenses I can identify." Victoria felt the world beginning to collapse around her. "I don't understand." $2 million, Victoria, Alexander said, his gray eyes boring into hers. $2 million has disappeared from our accounts over the past 18 months, and I want to know where it went. If you've ever had to choose between asking permission and saving someone you love, hit that like button now, because this story is about to reveal the devastating cost of secrets in a marriage. Victoria stood frozen in their kitchen, watching her husband transform from the man she loved into someone she barely recognized. Alexander's face was pale with shock and growing fury as he stared at the financial records spread across their granite countertop. "I can explain," Victoria said quietly, though she knew any explanation would sound like exactly what it was, a confession of systematic deception. "Explain how $2 million vanished without my knowledge." Alexander's voice was dangerously calm. "Explain how my own wife has been moving money behind my back for over a year." "Alexander, please sit down," Victoria said, moving toward him with her hands raised in a gesture of peace. "Let me tell you what's been happening." "What's been happening is theft," Alexander snapped, stepping away from her approach. "What's been happening is fraud. Victoria, you've been stealing from our family." "I haven't been stealing," Victoria protested, her voice rising despite her efforts to stay calm. "The money went to something important, something for our family." "Important?" Alexander laughed harshly. "Important enough to lie to me about it for 18 months? Important enough to forge my signature on bank authorizations?" "Yes, Victoria, I found those too." Victoria felt her face burn with shame and terror. "You weren't supposed to find out this way." "I wasn't supposed to find out at all," Alexander corrected. "Victoria, you've been planning to steal $2 million and disappear, haven't you? You've been moving our money somewhere I can't access it, probably offshore accounts or investments in your name only." "That's not what happened," Victoria said desperately. "Alexander, if you'll just let me explain." "Explain what?" Alexander's voice was getting louder, and Victoria could hear Oliver and Owen stirring upstairs. "Explain how you've been systematically robbing your own family? Explain how you've been lying to my face every single day while bleeding our accounts dry." "The money went to medical expenses," Victoria said quickly. "For Oliver and Owen. They needed treatment that insurance wouldn't cover." "Medical expenses?" Alexander stared at her in disbelief. "Victoria, I've seen every medical bill we've received. I've approved every treatment. There haven't been any major medical expenses." "There have been," Victoria insisted. "Experimental therapy that you would never have approved quickly enough. Treatment that saved our sons' futures." "You're lying," Alexander said flatly. "Victoria, you're standing there making up stories about medical expenses to cover up whatever you've really been doing with our money." "I'm not lying," Victoria said, tears beginning to flow freely now. "Alexander, Oliver and Owen have a genetic condition called progressive muscular atrophy. Without treatment, they would lose their mobility completely. The therapy cost $2 million, and it saved their lives." Alexander stared at her as if she'd lost her mind. "Progressive what?" "Victoria, there's nothing wrong with our children. They're perfectly healthy." "They're healthy because of the treatment," Victoria said desperately. "Because I used the money to pay for therapy that stopped the progression of their condition." "Victoria, stop," Alexander said sharply. "Stop making up elaborate medical stories to justify what you've done. Our children are fine. They've always been fine. You're fabricating illnesses to cover up theft." Victoria ran to the kitchen drawer where she kept important documents, pulling out medical files and test results. "Look at these," she said, shoving papers toward Alexander. "Look at Dr. Chen's reports, the genetic testing, the the treatment records. Alexander glanced at the papers dismissively. Anyone can fake medical documents, Victoria. Anyone can print official-looking forms to support their lies. These aren't fake, Victoria sobbed. Call Dr. Chin yourself. Ask her about Oliver and Owen's condition. I'm not calling anyone based on documents you could have created, Alexander said coldly. Victoria, I know what you've done. I know you've stolen $2 million from our family, and I know you're desperate enough to invent sick children to justify it. Victoria felt her world crumbling as she realized Alexander would never believe her without seeing the medical evidence himself, and by the time she could arrange that, legal proceedings would already be underway. Alexander, please, Victoria begged, falling to her knees beside their kitchen table. Please just trust me one more time. I know this looks horrible, but everything I did was to protect our children. Trust you. Alexander's voice was filled with disgust. Victoria, you've destroyed any possibility of trust between us. You've stolen from our family, lied to my face, and forged my signature on legal documents. Trust is the last thing you deserve from me. What are you going to do? Victoria whispered, though she already knew the answer. I'm going to file fraud charges against you, Alexander said simply. I'm going to divorce you and ensure you never have access to our family's assets again. And Victoria, I'm going to fight for full custody of Oliver and Owen because I won't let them be raised by a woman who steals from her own children's future. You can't take my children away from me, Victoria said, panic rising in her chest. Watch me, Alexander replied. Victoria, you've committed felony fraud. You've systematically stolen from your own family. No court in the world will give custody to a convicted thief. The next morning, Victoria woke up to find Alexander gone and divorce papers on her nightstand. By afternoon, a sheriff's deputy was at her door with a warrant for her arrest on charges of embezzlement and fraud. The legal proceedings that followed were swift and devastating. Alexander's team of attorneys painted Victoria as a calculating woman who had married for money and systematically stolen from her wealthy husband. Her claims about medical expenses were dismissed as elaborate justifications created after the fact. Your Honor, Alexander's lead attorney said during one hearing, Mrs. Blackwood has presented no credible evidence of these alleged medical expenses. The children show no signs of illness or disability. The medical documents she's provided could easily be fabricated to support her defense. Victoria's court-appointed attorney tried valiantly to present evidence of Oliver and Owen's condition, but the boys appeared healthy to casual observation, and Dr. Chin's records were dismissed as potentially compromised since Victoria had been the primary point of contact. Mrs. Blackwood, the judge said during sentencing, you've been found guilty of embezzling $2 million from your spouse. While I understand your attorney's claims about medical expenses, the evidence presented has not substantiated these allegations. You're sentenced to 2 years probation and full restitution of the stolen funds. Victoria stood in the courtroom, legally branded as a thief, watching her marriage dissolve and her children's custody awarded to the man who had refused to listen to her desperate attempts to explain the truth. The divorce was finalized 6 months later. Alexander gained primary custody of Oliver and Owen, while Victoria was granted supervised visitation every other weekend. The court cited her demonstrated pattern of financial deception and inability to maintain appropriate boundaries regarding family assets as reasons for limiting her access to her own children. Mommy, why don't you live with us anymore? 6-year-old Owen asked during one of Victoria's supervised visits at a sterile family center. Sometimes adults make difficult choices that change how families work, Victoria said carefully, not wanting to burden her sons with the truth about their father's refusal to believe in their medical condition. Did you do something bad? Oliver asked with the directness that only children possessed. Victoria looked at her son, this beautiful boy whose muscles were strong and healthy because of treatments his father believed were fictional, and felt her heart break all over again. I did something that Daddy didn't understand, Victoria said finally. But everything I did was because I love you and Owen more than anything in the world. We love you too, Mommy, Owen said, hugging her tightly. When can you come home? I don't know, sweetheart, Victoria whispered, holding both her sons and wondering if they would ever understand that she had saved their futures by destroying her own. For years past. Victoria rebuilt her life from the ashes of her reputation, returning to teaching art at a community center and living in a modest apartment across town from the mansion where her children grew up without her daily presence. Alexander threw himself into his work, building his business empire while hiring nannies to care for Oliver and Owen. The boys, now 10 years old, saw their mother every other weekend under the watchful eye of court-appointed supervisors. They loved her desperately, but had adapted to a life where mommy was a visitor rather than a constant presence. Alexander convinced himself he had done the right thing, protecting his children from a woman who had proven herself capable of devastating deception. He never investigated Victoria's claims about medical expenses, satisfied that the courts had determined her guilt and his righteousness. But children have a way of forcing truth into the light, even when adults work hard to keep it buried. "Dad, why do my hands feel shaky sometimes?" Oliver asked one morning as he struggled to button his school uniform. "You're probably just tired, buddy," Alexander replied, barely looking up from his morning financial reports. "Owen has trouble with buttons too," Oliver observed. "And we both get tired really fast when we play soccer." "Growing boys need lots of sleep," Alexander said automatically. "Make sure you're getting to bed on time." But Oliver's observations planted a seed of doubt that grew over the following weeks. Alexander began noticing small things he had previously dismissed as normal childhood clumsiness. The boys seemed to fatigue more easily than their classmates. Their handwriting had become progressively messier. Owen had started dropping things more frequently. "Mr. Blackwood," Oliver's teacher said during a parent conference, "I've noticed some concerns about Oliver's fine motor skills. He's having difficulty with tasks that used to be easy for him, like cutting with scissors or holding a pencil properly." "What kind of concerns?" Alexander asked, suddenly paying close attention. "It might be worth having him evaluated by a pediatric specialist," the teacher suggested gently. "Sometimes children develop coordination issues that benefit from early intervention." That evening, Alexander found himself staring at his sons as they played video games, noticing for the first time how they both seemed to struggle with the controllers in ways that hadn't been apparent the year before. "Boys, how long have you been having trouble with your hands?" Alexander asked casually. "What trouble?" Owen asked, though Alexander could see him adjust his grip on the controller. "It's not trouble exactly," Oliver said thoughtfully. "It's just harder than it used to be. Like my fingers don't want to do what I tell them to." Alexander felt a chill run down his spine. "Has this been going on for a long time?" "I don't know," Owen shrugged. "Maybe since we were little, but it's getting more obvious now." That night, Alexander lay awake thinking about Victoria's claims during their divorce proceedings. Her desperate insistence that the children had a medical condition requiring expensive treatment. Her tears as she begged him to trust her just one more time. What if she hadn't been lying? What if the money really had gone to medical expenses that saved their children from something terrible? Alexander pushed the thought away. Victoria had been found guilty of fraud by a court of law. Multiple attorneys and a judge had examined her claims and found them false. She was a convicted thief who had destroyed their family through greed and deception. But as weeks passed and Oliver and Owen's subtle symptoms became more apparent, Alexander found himself haunted by possibilities he had refused to consider for years earlier. The manila envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning, addressed to Alexander with a return address from Dr. Patricia Chen's medical practice. Alexander stared at the envelope for several minutes before opening it, sensing that whatever was inside would change everything he thought he knew about his life. Inside was a cover letter and a thick stack of medical records dating back 6 years. "Dear Mr. Blackwood," the letter began, "I am writing to inform you that Dr. Patricia Chen passed away last month. As part of settling her estate, we are releasing patient records that were maintained under doctor-patient confidentiality during her lifetime. Your children, Oliver and Owen Blackwood, were patients of Dr. Chen's, and we believe you should have access to their complete medical history." Alexander's hands shook as he opened the medical files. The first page was a genetic testing report dated 6 years earlier, when the boys were 4 years old. Diagnosis: progressive muscular atrophy, type 2. Patients Oliver and Owen Blackwood test positive for genetic markers indicating certain muscular degeneration without intervention. Alexander felt the world tilt around him as he read page after page of medical documentation, specialist consultations, treatment plans, progress reports on experimental gene therapy that had cost exactly $2 million over 18 months. Every word Victoria had spoken during their confrontation had been true. Every desperate plea she had made had been honest. Every document she had shown him had been real. His children had been dying, and Victoria had saved them while he accused her of theft. Alexander sank into his office chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of his mistake. The medical records painted a clear picture of two little boys facing a devastating diagnosis and a mother who had moved heaven and earth to save them while their father remained completely ignorant. Treatment outcome: significant improvement in muscle strength and coordination. Disease progression halted. Patients show near-complete recovery of normal function. Continued monitoring recommended. Victoria hadn't stolen $2 million. She had invested $2 million in their children's futures, and that investment had literally saved Oliver and Owen's lives. Alexander thought about the custody battle, the fraud charges, the supervised visitation that had reduced Victoria to a weekend visitor in her own children's lives. He thought about 4 years of believing he was the victim of his wife's greed when he had actually been the beneficiary of her sacrifice. Most devastating of all, he thought about Victoria sitting in that courtroom, legally branded as a thief for the crime of saving her children without her husband's permission. Alexander reached for his phone to call Victoria, then stopped. What could he possibly say? How could he explain that he had destroyed their family based on assumptions rather than investigation? How could he apologize for 4 years of believing the worst about the woman who had made the most selfless decision any parent could make? The medical records lay spread across his desk like evidence of his own moral failure. Every page proved that Victoria had been the hero of their story while he had cast himself as the victim. Alexander Blackwood, billionaire CEO and destroyer of his own family, finally understood that some mistakes were too enormous to fix with money or apologies. But he was going to try anyway. Alexander sat in his office for 3 hours, reading and rereading the medical records that proved his wife had been innocent of everything he'd accused her of. The afternoon sun moved across his desk, casting long shadows over documents that detailed his children's near-death sentence and their mother's heroic response to it. Progressive muscular atrophy, type 2. Alexander read aloud, his voice hoarse from crying. Without treatment, patients typically lose mobility by age 12 and require full-time care by age 16. The medical timeline was devastating in its clarity. Dr. Chun had diagnosed the twins when they were 4 years old. Victoria had begun the experimental treatment immediately, using their joint account to fund therapy that would either save their children's futures or fail completely. Patient response: excellent. Muscle deterioration halted within 6 months of treatment initiation. Motor function improvement noted by month 8. Near-complete recovery achieved by month 16. Alexander closed his eyes, trying to imagine the weight Victoria had carried alone. Knowing their children faced a degenerative disease while their father obsessed over grocery receipts and art supply expenses. Making life-or-death medical decisions while her husband demanded explanations for every $60 purchase. Mr. Blackwood? His assistant's voice came through the intercom. Your 4 o'clock appointment is here. Cancel it, Alexander said quietly. Cancel everything for the rest of the week. Sir? The Meridian merger meeting is scheduled for tomorrow morning. The investors are flying in from London specifically for. Cancel it all, Jennifer, Alexander repeated firmly. Tell them there's been a family emergency. There had been a family emergency. There had been one for 4 years, and Alexander was only now understanding the scope of the catastrophe he had created. He picked up his phone to call Victoria, then set it down again. What could he possibly say in a phone call? How could he compress 4 years of wrongful accusations into a conversation? How could he explain that he had destroyed their family over a lie he had created himself? Alexander drove home early, something he hadn't done since the divorce. His mansion felt enormous and empty as he walked through rooms filled with expensive furniture but devoid of the warmth that had once made it a home. Dad, Oliver's voice called from the kitchen. You're home early. Alexander found his 10-year-old son sitting at the breakfast bar, working on homework while their nanny, Mrs. Patterson, prepared dinner. Seeing them now, with the knowledge of their medical history, Alexander noticed details that had previously escaped his attention. Owen held his pencil differently than other children, gripping it tighter to compensate for muscle weakness. Oliver's handwriting was careful and deliberate, each letter formed with the concentration of someone whose fine motor skills required extra effort. "How was school today?" Alexander asked, sitting beside his sons for the first time in months. "Good," Owen replied automatically, though Alexander could see fatigue in his posture. "We had PE today. I couldn't do all the rope climbing, but coach said that's okay." "Why couldn't you do the rope climbing?" Alexander asked gently. Owen shrugged with the casualness of a child who had learned to adapt to limitations without understanding their source. "My arms get tired faster than other kids. They always have." "Always?" Alexander pressed. "Well, not when we were really little," Oliver said thoughtfully. "But for a long time now. Mom used to help us with exercises that made us stronger." Alexander felt his chest tighten. "What kind of exercises?" "Fun ones," Owen said with a smile. "She had these special games that were actually therapy, but we didn't know that until later. She made everything feel like playing." "When did Mom teach you these exercises?" Alexander asked carefully. "During our therapy time," Oliver replied matter-of-factly. "When we were little, we went to Boston every week to play special games with doctors. Mom said it was to help us stay strong and healthy." Alexander stared at his sons, realizing they had vague but positive memories of the treatment that had saved their lives. Victoria had somehow made experimental medical therapy feel like an adventure rather than a burden. "Do you remember much about those trips to Boston?" Alexander asked. "Some," Owen said. "We stayed in a hotel sometimes, and Mom would order room service for breakfast. She said we were very brave boys doing very important work." "Did I ever come with you to Boston?" Alexander asked, though he already knew the answer. "No," Oliver said simply. "You were always working. But Mom said you loved us very much and that you were proud of how well we were doing with our special exercises." Alexander felt tears burning behind his eyes. Even while secretly funding their children's medical treatment, Victoria had protected his relationship with Oliver and Owen. She had never portrayed him as absent or uninterested, only busy with important work. "Boys," Alexander said carefully, "what do you remember about when Mom and Dad got divorced?" Oliver and Owen exchanged a look that spoke of conversations they'd had together over the years. "We remember lots of fighting," Owen said quietly. "Loud voices downstairs at night. Mom crying sometimes. Dad was angry about money," Oliver added. "Mom kept saying she could explain, but Dad wouldn't listen." Alexander's heart broke at his son's simple recounting of the worst period in their family's history. "What did you think about the fighting?" "We thought it was our fault," Owen said matter-of-factly. "We thought maybe we cost too much money with our doctor visits and exercises. We asked Mom if we could stop going to Boston so Dad wouldn't be mad anymore," Oliver continued. "But Mom said our health was more important than anything else, and that the fighting wasn't our fault." Alexander pulled both boys into a hug, overwhelmed by the weight of their innocent observations. His children had been willing to sacrifice their medical treatment to stop their parents fighting, while Victoria had protected them from understanding the true cost of their therapy. "The fighting was never your fault," Alexander said firmly. "And your health is the most important thing in the world to both Mom and Dad. Then why doesn't Mom live with us anymore?" Owen asked with the directness that only children possessed. Alexander looked at his sons, these beautiful boys who had survived a devastating diagnosis because their mother had been brave enough to save them without permission. How could he explain that their father had been too controlling and suspicious to trust their mother's judgment about their own children? "Sometimes adults make mistakes," Alexander said carefully. "Sometimes they get confused about what's important and make decisions they later regret." "Did you make a mistake?" Oliver asked. Alexander felt the truth lodged in his throat like a stone. "Yes," he whispered. "I made a very big mistake." That evening, after Mrs. Patterson had taken the boys to their rooms for bedtime routines, Alexander sat alone in his study, surrounded by medical records and financial statements that told the story of his family's destruction. He pulled out his laptop and began researching progressive muscular atrophy, learning everything he could about the condition that had threatened his children's futures. Every medical journal article confirmed what Dr. Chen's records had documented. Without early intervention, Oliver and Owen would have faced progressive disability and significantly shortened life expectancy. The experimental gene therapy Victoria had funded was now considered the gold standard treatment for pediatric PMA. Success rates were extraordinary when treatment began before age 6, exactly when Victoria had started the boys' therapy. Treatment cost typically ranges from $1.8 to $2 million over 18 months, Alexander read in a recent medical journal. Early intervention is critical for optimal outcomes. Delays in treatment initiation significantly impact long-term prognosis. Victoria had acted within the optimal treatment window, spending exactly the amount recommended by leading specialists, achieving results that had given their children normal, healthy lives. Everything she had done had been medically sound and parentally heroic. Alexander opened their old financial records, tracing Victoria's careful withdrawals over the 18-month treatment period. She had been methodical and strategic, moving money in amounts that wouldn't immediately trigger his attention while ensuring the medical facility received payments on schedule. Payment for developmental specialists, Alexander read from one of Victoria's expense reports. Technically accurate but deliberately vague, designed to fund their children's life-saving treatment while avoiding his financial control mechanisms. Looking at the records now, Alexander could see the pattern of a desperate mother trying to save her children while protecting them from their father's need to control every financial decision. Victoria had known him well enough to predict that he would delay, research, and cost-analyze their children's medical emergency until it was too late to achieve optimal results. Alexander found copies of emails Victoria had sent to their insurance company, appealing coverage denials and fighting for any financial assistance available. She had exhausted every legitimate option before resorting to using their personal funds. Mrs. Blackwood, one insurance representative had written, "While we understand the severity of your children's condition, experimental therapies are not covered under your current policy. We recommend pursuing traditional physical therapy options that fall within your coverage parameters. Traditional therapy that would have been inadequate for the boy's condition." Victoria had known that conventional treatments wouldn't save Oliver and Owen's futures, so she had found a way to pay for the therapy that would. Alexander spent hours reading Victoria's correspondence with Dr. Chen's office, seeing the careful planning and desperate hope in every message. "Dr. Chen, I need to confirm that payment can be made in installments over the treatment period," Victoria had written. "My husband handles our finances, and I need to structure payments in a way that ensures continuous treatment for Oliver and Owen." Even in her deception, Victoria had been thinking of their children's needs first. She had arranged the payments to guarantee the boys wouldn't lose access to treatment if Alexander discovered her activities too early. Alexander found medical progress reports documenting Oliver and Owen's improvement throughout the therapy period. Monthly assessments showing muscle strength increases, coordination improvements, and the gradual halt of degenerative processes. Month 12, patients show remarkable improvement in all assessed areas. Muscle deterioration has ceased completely. Motor function now within normal ranges for age group. Treatment continuation recommended through month 18 for optimal long-term outcomes. Victoria had saved their children's lives, and Alexander had punished her for it. The next morning, Alexander called Dr. Chen's former practice to verify the authenticity of the medical records. "Mr. Blackwood," the office manager confirmed, "these are definitely authentic documents from Dr. Chen's files." She was very meticulous about documentation, especially for experimental treatments. "Your sons were remarkable success stories. Why wasn't I included in their medical care?" Alexander asked. There was a pause before the response. "According to our records, Mrs. Blackwood was listed as the primary contact for all medical decisions. She indicated that you traveled frequently for business and preferred her to handle the children's medical appointments." Another lie Victoria had told to protect him from having to approve expensive treatment he might have delayed or denied. She had shielded him from difficult decisions while ensuring their children received optimal care. "Can you tell me about the prognosis for children who don't receive this treatment?" Alexander asked. "Without early intervention, progressive muscular atrophy typically progresses rapidly during elementary school years," the office manager explained. "Children usually require mobility assistance by age 10 or 11, and full-time care by their teens. Mr. Blackwood, your wife's decision to pursue immediate treatment likely saved your sons from severe disability. Alexander thanked the office manager and hung up, overwhelmed by the magnitude of Victoria's sacrifice. She hadn't just spent money to help their children. She had saved Oliver and Owen from a future of progressive disability and dependence. That afternoon, Alexander drove to the boys' school to observe them during recess. He sat in his car in the parking lot, watching through the fence as Oliver and Owen played with their classmates. They ran, jumped, and climbed playground equipment with the easy confidence of healthy children. Without Victoria's intervention, they would likely be in wheelchairs by now. Alexander thought about the last 4 years, the custody arrangement that had reduced Victoria to a weekend visitor while he maintained primary custody based on her demonstrated financial irresponsibility. He had convinced himself he was protecting Oliver and Owen from their mother's poor judgment, while Victoria had actually been the one protecting them all along. "Dad," Owen called, spotting Alexander through the fence. "What are you doing here?" Alexander got out of his car and approached the playground. "I wanted to see how you boys were doing at school." "We're doing great," Oliver said, hanging from the monkey bars with strength that wouldn't have been possible without Victoria's secret medical intervention. "Want to see how far I can run?" Alexander watched his son sprint across the playground, his movements fluid and strong. Every step Oliver took was possible because Victoria had found a way to pay for treatment that had preserved his mobility. "Oliver's really fast now," Owen observed with pride in his brother. "He won the 50-yard dash at field day last month." "That's wonderful," Alexander said, his voice thick with emotion he couldn't quite hide. "Are you okay, Dad?" Oliver asked, returning from his run with barely any signs of fatigue. "You look sad." Alexander knelt down to his son's eye level, looking into faces that showed no signs of the degenerative disease that would have stolen their childhoods. "I'm not sad," Alexander said truthfully. "I'm grateful. More grateful than I've ever been in my life." That evening, Alexander found himself driving past Victoria's apartment complex. He sat in the parking lot, looking up at the modest building where the woman who had saved their children's lives now lived alone. Alexander imagined Victoria in her small apartment, probably grading papers from her art classes or preparing lessons for the community center where she taught. Living simply while he occupied a mansion that felt increasingly empty and meaningless. He thought about calling her, but what could he say? How could he begin to apologize for 4 years of believing the worst about her? How could he explain that he had finally discovered the truth about her theft and understood it was actually the most selfless act any parent could perform? Alexander pulled out his phone and started typing a text message, then deleted it. He tried calling, then hung up before the first ring. No phone call or text could adequately address the magnitude of his mistake. Over the next week, Alexander found himself obsessively researching everything about Oliver and Owen's condition and treatment. He read medical journals, parent forums, and specialist recommendations, trying to understand every decision Victoria had made. "Dr. Martinez," Alexander said during a consultation with a leading pediatric neurologist, "I need to understand the long-term prognosis for children who received early gene therapy for progressive muscular atrophy. The results are excellent when treatment begins before age 6, Dr. Martinez explained. Children who receive early intervention typically maintain normal function throughout their lives. Without treatment, the progression is quite rapid and devastating. What would my son's condition be now if they hadn't received treatment 6 years ago?" Alexander asked. Dr. Martinez reviewed the medical records Alexander had brought. Based on their genetic markers and initial presentation, they would likely require significant mobility assistance by now. Wheelchairs, probably full-time care within a few years. "Mr. Blackwood, whoever made the decision to pursue immediate treatment saved your children from severe disability." "Their mother made that decision," Alexander said quietly, "without my knowledge or support. Then she made exactly the right choice at exactly the right time," Dr. Martinez said firmly. "Delays in treatment for PMA can be catastrophic. Parents who act quickly and decisively give their children the best possible outcomes." Alexander left the consultation understanding that Victoria's secrecy hadn't been about deception. It had been about saving their children from his tendency to overthink financial decisions that required immediate action. That weekend, During Oliver and Owen's scheduled visit with Victoria, Alexander found himself driving to the supervised visitation center where his ex-wife was legally required to see their children under court oversight. Through the window, he watched Victoria help the boys with art projects, her face lighting up with the joy that only came from time with her children. Oliver and Owen were animated and happy, clearly comfortable with their mother despite the artificial constraints of supervised visits. "She's a good mother," said Mrs. Williams, the court-appointed supervisor who had overseen hundreds of visits over the past 4 years. "I've never seen anything concerning in her interactions with the children. They clearly love her very much." "Why do you think the court required supervision?" Alexander asked, though he already knew the answer. "Financial crimes," Mrs. Williams replied. "The court was concerned about her judgment regarding money management. But honestly, Mr. Blackwood, I've never understood why financial issues would require supervised visits when there's no evidence of any parenting problems." Alexander watched Victoria laugh at something Oliver had said, her entire face transforming with happiness at this small moment with her children. She had been reduced to 2 hours of supervised time every other weekend because Alexander had convinced a court that her theft made her unfit for regular custody. "Mrs. Williams," Alexander said carefully, "what would happen if new evidence emerged that changed the circumstances of the original custody decision?" "Custody arrangements can be modified when there's been a substantial change in circumstances," Mrs. Williams replied. "If evidence emerged that the original decision was based on incorrect information, the court would certainly reconsider." Alexander nodded, understanding that he had the power to restore Victoria's relationship with their children. The medical records proved her innocence, and his testimony about discovering the truth could reverse the custody restrictions that had punished her for heroism disguised as crime. Monday morning, Alexander called his attorney. "Richard, I need to modify the custody arrangement with my ex-wife," Alexander said without preamble. "Modify how?" Richard Steinberg asked. "Alexander, you have primary custody, and she has supervised visitation. You won the case completely. I need to reverse it," Alexander said firmly. "I want joint custody, equal time, and no supervision required." "Alexander, what's changed? For years ago, you were convinced Victoria was a dangerous influence on the children." "For years ago, I was wrong," Alexander said simply. "Richard, I have medical evidence that proves Victoria used the money for legitimate medical expenses. She didn't steal from our family. She saved our children's lives." There was a long pause. "Alexander, this is a significant development. If you have evidence that contradicts the original fraud findings, we need to examine it carefully." "The evidence is overwhelming," Alexander said. "Victoria was innocent of everything I accused her of. She was actually the hero of our story while I cast myself as the victim. This could have implications for the criminal charges as well," Richard noted. "If the fraud charges were based on false premises, Victoria might have grounds for wrongful prosecution claims." Alexander felt sick thinking about the legal consequences Victoria had faced based on his accusations. "Whatever she needs to clear her record, we'll support completely." "Richard, I destroyed my family over a misunderstanding. I need to fix this." "Alexander, are you prepared for the possibility that Victoria might not be interested in reconciliation? She spent 4 years rebuilding her life after very public fraud charges. She might not want to revisit this situation." Alexander considered this sobering possibility. Victoria had every right to reject his attempts at reconciliation. She had every reason to refuse his apologies and continue with the life she had built in the aftermath of his accusations. "I have to try," Alexander said. "Richard, I can't live with myself knowing I punished the most selfless person I've ever known for saving our children's lives." That evening, Alexander sat Oliver and Owen down for the most important conversation of their young lives. "Boys, I need to tell you something about Mom," Alexander said, his heart racing with anxiety about how to explain 4 years of injustice to 10-year-olds. "What about Mom?" Oliver asked, immediately alert to the serious tone in his father's voice. "Do you remember when you were little and Mom took you to Boston for those special exercises?" Alexander began, The therapy games, Owen said with a smile. Those were fun. Those weren't just games, Alexander said gently. They were medical treatments that Mom arranged because you boys had a condition that could have made you very sick. Oliver and Owen looked at each other with confusion. What kind of condition? Oliver asked. A muscle condition that would have made it hard for you to run and play and do all the things you love, Alexander explained. Mom found out about it when you were little, and she made sure you got the treatment that kept you healthy. Is that why Mom doesn't live with us? Owen asked with startling perceptiveness. Because of the medicine that helped us? Alexander felt tears burning behind his eyes. Mom had to spend a lot of money to pay for your treatment, and Dad got angry because he didn't understand what the money was for. You got angry at Mom for helping us get better? Oliver asked, his young face showing confusion and hurt. Dad made a mistake, Alexander said, the words feeling completely inadequate. A very big mistake. Dad thought Mom was doing something wrong when she was actually doing something heroic. Heroic? Owen repeated. Mom saved your lives, Alexander said simply. She made sure you got the medicine you needed to stay strong and healthy, even when it was very difficult and expensive. The boys absorbed this information with the seriousness that children bring to life-changing revelations. Does Mom know that you know? Oliver asked. Not yet, Alexander admitted. But I'm going to tell her. And I'm going to apologize for not understanding what she was doing. Can Mom come live with us again? Owen asked hopefully. Alexander felt his heart break at the innocent question. I don't know if Mom will want to live with us again after Dad made such a big mistake. But I'm going to ask her if we can be a family again. You should bring her flowers, Oliver suggested seriously. Mom likes flowers. And chocolate, Owen added. She always smiles when people give her chocolate. Alexander smiled through his tears at his son's earnest advice about reconciliation gestures. Those are good ideas. But boys, the most important thing is that Mom knows how sorry Dad is for not believing her when she was trying to help you. That night, Alexander lay awake planning what he would say to Victoria. How could he possibly explain 4 years of wrongful accusations? How could he apologize for destroying their family over medical expenses that had saved their children's lives? Friday afternoon, Alexander stood outside Victoria's apartment building, medical records in his hands and his heart pounding with anxiety. He had rehearsed his words 100 times, but nothing felt adequate to address the magnitude of his mistake. This was the moment when everything would change again. Either Victoria would give him a chance to make amends for 4 years of injustice, or she would close the door on any possibility of rebuilding their family. Alexander walked up the stairs to Victoria's second-floor apartment, each step carrying the weight of his guilt and hope. He had destroyed the most important relationship in his life over a lie he had created himself. Now he had to find out if love could survive the devastation of financial control and wrongful accusations. He reached Victoria's door and raised his hand to knock, knowing that everything that happened next would determine whether his family could be healed or whether some mistakes were simply too enormous to forgive. Alexander knocked twice, hearing footsteps approach from inside the apartment. The door opened, and Victoria appeared, her face cycling through surprise, confusion, and wariness at seeing her ex-husband on her doorstep. Alexander, Victoria said cautiously, "What are you doing here? Is something wrong with the boys?" "The boys are fine," Alexander said quickly. "Victoria, I need to talk to you. I need to show you something." Victoria's expression hardened slightly. "If this is about changing the visitation schedule or some legal matter, you should call my attorney." "It's not about that," Alexander said, holding up the manila envelope containing the medical records. "Victoria, this is about the truth. The truth about the money you took. The truth about Oliver and Owen's condition. The truth about everything I accused you of." Victoria's face went pale as she stared at the envelope. "What are you talking about?" "I know about progressive muscular atrophy," Alexander said quietly. "I know about Dr. Chun, the experimental therapy, the $2 million that saved our children's lives. Victoria, I know you were never stealing from us. You were saving us." Victoria's hands began to shake as she processed his words. "How do you know about their condition?" "Dr. Chin died last month," Alexander explained. "Her practice released the medical records to me as next of kin. Victoria, I've seen everything. The diagnosis, the treatment plans, the progress reports." I know that everything you did was to protect Oliver and Owen. Victoria leaned against the doorframe, overwhelmed by the revelation that her secret had finally been discovered. Alexander, I tried to tell you. I begged you to listen, to let me explain. I know, Alexander said, his voice breaking. I know you tried to tell me, and I refused to listen. I know you tried to show me medical evidence, and I dismissed it as fake. Victoria, I know that I destroyed our family over a lie I created myself. Victoria stared at him, years of pain and injustice written across her face. Do you have any idea what you put me through? Do you understand what it was like to be branded a thief for saving our children's lives? I'm beginning to understand, Alexander said quietly. And Victoria, I will spend the rest of my life trying to make amends for what I did to you, to our family, to the boys who needed both their parents and only had one because their father was too controlling to trust their mother's judgment. Victoria was crying now, tears streaming down her face as 4 years of suppressed emotion finally found release. I lost my children because I saved their lives. I became a weekend visitor in my own sons' lives because I made sure they would have normal, healthy futures. You saved them, Alexander said firmly. Victoria, without your intervention, Oliver and Owen would be in wheelchairs by now. They would face a future of progressive disability and dependence. You gave them normal lives, and I punished you for it. What do you want from me now? Victoria asked, her voice exhausted by the weight of revelation and years of injustice. Alexander looked at the woman he had loved, lost, and wronged so completely. I want to give you back everything I took from you. I want to restore your relationship with our children. I want to clear your legal record of charges that should never have been filed. And Victoria, if you'll let me, I want to spend the rest of my life proving that I can be the husband and father you deserved from the beginning. Victoria stared at him, processing an apology that was 4 years too late, but still might be enough to begin healing the wounds he had inflicted. Alexander, Victoria said slowly, I don't know if I can trust you again. I don't know if our family can be repaired after everything that's happened. I don't know either, Alexander admitted. But Victoria, I know that Oliver and Owen need their mother in their lives every day, not just on supervised weekends. I know that you were the hero of our story while I was the villain, and I know that if there's any chance of making this right, I have to start by telling you that I was wrong about everything. Victoria looked at the medical records in his hands, proof of her innocence and his guilt, evidence that everything she had suffered had been based on his failure to trust the woman who had saved their children. Come in, Victoria said finally, stepping aside to let Alexander enter the small apartment where she had rebuilt her life in the aftermath of his accusations. We need to talk. To be continued.